Have you ever stopped to wonder why we are strictly forbidden from even questioning the official dates of the greatest engineering masterpieces of the 19th century? We've been taught since childhood to accept, on faith, the romantic but utterly improbable fairy tale of bearded men in simple clothes who, armed with nothing more than a pickaxe, a shovel, and inhuman enthusiasm, created technical marvels. These achievements, mind you, even today, in the age of lasers and satellite navigation, cause serious difficulties and headaches for the most seasoned engineers. But what if the picture of technological progress has been systematically distorted for our entire lives? What if the history we studied in school is not a reliable chronicle of events, but a carefully edited script designed to hide one simple but extremely frightening fact? We are not living at the peak of development, but on the majestic ruins of an older, far more advanced civilization, whose achievements we are now merely clumsily and with great difficulty trying to apply and exploit, passing them off as our own breakthroughs. Today, we will look at an example that literally pierces the official, seemingly unshakable chronology. We are talking about the Alps, a natural stone fortress, a giant ridge that divided European nations for centuries. And suddenly, as if by someone's command, in the mid-19th century, when the primary mode of transport was still the horse and streets were lit by gas or wax candles, humanity began to massively chew its way into granite mountain ranges. We are told that the construction of the world's first great mountain tunnel, known as Mont Cenis or Frejus, started in 1857. Ponder that date, 1857. The United States hadn't even gone through its devastating civil war yet. In the Russian Empire, they were just preparing to abolish serfdom. Medicine during this period was at the level of questionable bloodletting. And at this very time, engineers from France and the Kingdom of Sardinia decide to bore through 13 kilometers of solid granite and quartz. 13 kilometers of rock, without the use of dynamite in its modern sense, without electricity, without modern jackhammers. The official version states that the work was carried out simultaneously from two sides. The French moved from the north and the Italians from the south. And this is where the most interesting part begins, the one that makes the hair on the back of any specialist familiar with geodesy literally stand on end. We're told that the tunnels met, that is, the two crews joined on December 25, 1870. And pay attention, the deviation of the tunnel axes was less than 60 centimeters horizontally and less than 30 centimeters vertically.
Do you understand what that means? That is a level of jeweler's precision. Even today, using the most modern laser levels, gyrotheodolites, and GPS satellite navigation, engineers make errors. And we are asked to believe that in pitch darkness, in the mid-19th century, lit only by oil lamps, people were able to pass through a 13-kilometer mountain mass and meet almost perfectly. This accuracy simply could not have been achieved at that time with primitive tools and methods. But even if we disregard the incredible geodetic calculations and accuracy, an even more important question arises concerning the physiology and physics of the process. How did they drill? Historians insist that the first years of work were carried out exclusively by manual labor and with the use of black powder. Imagine a narrow drift that goes for kilometers deep into the mountain. There is no ventilation, no electric pumps for forced fresh air supply. And in this confined space, you explode black powder, which releases clouds of carbon monoxide and poisonous combustion products. In such conditions, this means immediate peril. How could the workers breathe and even survive? Official sources vaguely mention some hydraulic compressors that worked using the energy of mountain rivers at the tunnel entrance. But the power of such installations in that era was insufficient. It physically could not pump the necessary volume of air 5 to 6 kilometers deep into a narrow tube, given the inevitable pressure losses. Workers should have succumbed to suffocation by the hundreds every day. However, in the sparse reports, we see only suspiciously low and dry statistics of accidents, which clearly seem understated for such truly arduous labor. Let's move on to the volume of work performed. To bore a tunnel of this diameter, designed for a double-track railway, millions of cubic meters of rock must be extracted. Moreover, we are talking about granite, one of the hardest rocks on our planet. How was this rock transported? By horses? A horse would not survive long in a poorly ventilated tunnel. It would fall much faster than a person. By hand carts? Imagine the logistical nightmare. Thousands of people with carts running back and forth over a distance of up to 5 kilometers. This would create an unimaginable congestion, and construction would halt in the very first month. But we are told that the rate of tunneling, on the contrary, was constantly increasing. Allegedly, it was specifically for this project that the engineer Germain Sommeiller created the pneumatic drilling machine. What a surprising coincidence. As soon as a technically impossible task arises, a wonder machine is magically pulled out of the sleeve, whose blueprints raise more questions than they provide answers. These machines were very bulky, required a complex system of compressed air tubes that constantly failed, and yet construction did not stop for a single day.
This is where the greatest secret lies. What if these machines were not invented for drilling, but for a completely different purpose, for clearing? What if the Mont Cenis tunnel was not bored in the 19th century, but simply excavated? Look at the portals of these tunnels, at their entrances. They are monumental structures, executed in a solemn antique style, decorated with columns, battlements, and complex masonry. Why such incredible grandeur for a simple hole in a mountain intended for the passage of steam locomotives that would cover this beauty with soot in literally a week? The builders of the 19th century were strictly pragmatic people. They built functional, cheap factories out of red brick. But here, we see an entrance that looks more like the entrance to an ancient temple. Perhaps it was indeed the entrance to something else, to the transportation artery of a civilization that existed long before us and possessed the technologies to cut granite like we cut butter. Now, let's go back to logistics. Look at the old photographs that have reached us from the construction. Do you see thousands of workers there? Do you see mountains, real mountains, not small piles, of extracted rock at the entrances? Where did the millions of tons of stone go? Usually new mountains of rubble grow near such large-scale construction sites, but in the rare photographs and engravings, we see only neat platforms and small accumulations of stones. This does not look like construction from scratch. It looks very much like a major renovation. We, in essence, arrived to find everything ready, discovered the blockages, applied what were in fact primitive technologies to clear these blockages, and called it the greatest engineering achievement of the 19th century. But if they simply excavated this tunnel, then who actually created it? And where did those who could melt stone and lay roads through the heart of inaccessible mountains vanish? The answer to this question is far more unsettling than the mere fact of the falsification of the construction history, because it leads us to the shocking understanding humanity may not be progressing, but on the contrary, degrading after some global planetary catastrophe. We must delve into details that official historians prefer to avoid, preferring to feed us romantic legends about heroic labor.
Let's move to the next object, which was even more impossible for those years, the St. Gotthard Tunnel. This structure surpasses Mont Cenis in its grandeur, 15 kilometers bored through the very heart of the Swiss Alps. The official construction dates from 1872 to 1882, that is only 10 years. Think about those figures. They had to advance an average of 4.5 meters per day. 4.5 meters of granite, gneiss, and quartz every single day for 10 years without a single holiday or day off. And this is despite the fact that the technology of that time, even according to the most optimistic descriptions in old encyclopedias, was extremely unreliable, constantly required maintenance, and frequently broke down. But the incredible speed of tunneling is only the tip of the iceberg of total deception. So we stopped at the absurdity called St. Gotthard, 15 kilometers of incredible tunneling speed per year, following the equally mysterious Mont Cenis. But let's return to Mont Cenis to finally understand how much the notions of technological capabilities in the mid-19th century have been misrepresented to us. Imagine the context of the era. 1857. This was a time when the main, most advanced medical method often remained bloodletting. We are talking about a level of development where antibiotics did not exist, sterilization was not practiced, and anesthesia was only just entering practice. And in this world dominated by sickness, scarcity, and primitive technologies, a group of engineers decides to bore almost 13 kilometers of solid granite, demanding inhuman productivity from workers and equipment. The very proposal to bore such a tunnel without dynamite and electricity solely by the power of steam, water, and human muscles looks like nonsense. We are led to believe that the tunneling went excellently, culminating in that very Christmas of 1870 when the two crews met in the heart of the mountain. And here awaits the most discouraging fact, which I already mentioned, but which must be fully laid out in all its incredibility. The perfect alignment. A deviation of only 60 centimeters horizontally and 30 centimeters vertically over a distance of 13 kilometers. This is not just accuracy, it's jeweler's precision, the achievement of which required constant and unprecedented control over 13 years. This demanded an impeccable geodetic base, instruments capable of working in conditions of constant vibration, smoke, and humidity, and most importantly, absolutely precise knowledge of the mountain profile. None of this was available to engineers in 1857.
The geodetic instruments of that time, simple theodolites, introduced an error that accumulated with every kilometer of the route. Moreover, to start the work, precise triangulation had to be carried out over the mountain range, and then this data transferred down into the drift. Anyone familiar with optics and physics knows that at such a distance and in such conditions, temperature, humidity, optical distortions from steam and smoke, ensuring such accuracy is impossible. If they were actually drilling, their tunnels should have diverged by tens, if not hundreds of meters, requiring years of costly correction. But they converged almost perfectly. This suggests one thing. They were not creating the tunnel axis. They were following an already existing, perfectly verified axis. Now let's move on to the question of what was happening inside the mountain. The official history tries to explain the absence of mass peril from suffocation by the invention of Sommelier's pneumatic machine, which allegedly worked on compressed air and simultaneously ventilated the tunnel. But this explanation contradicts the laws of physics. The deeper the crew went into the tunnel, the greater the pressure required to supply air. Imagine a kilometer-long pipe through which air must be driven so that people could breathe it and so it could carry out the combustion products of the powder. At 6 kilometers, this is not just difficult, it is a thermodynamic dead end for mid-19th century technologies. Hydraulic compressors, powered by mountain streams, simply could not create the necessary pressure for such a length. And now, let's add logistics. Every working day, tens of tons of rock had to be extracted, and tons of coal, wood, materials for reinforcement, and tools had to be delivered inside. We are talking about thousands of trips with handcarts on muddy, slippery rails in complete darkness. Under such conditions, the tunnel should have turned into an absolute logistical collapse, where carts would be stuck in traffic and work would advance by meters per month, not kilometers per year. This forces us to return to the conclusion.
What was presented to us as construction was actually desealing. Someone before us bored this tunnel, but when some planetary cataclysm occurred, which we will discuss later, the tunnel was sealed either by mud flows or collapses. The task of the 19th century engineers was not to bore through granite, but to clear an already existing thoroughfare using the fashionable, but quite primitive for this task, pneumatic tools. Saumulier's machine may not have been drilling, but simply breaking and clearing softer, collapsed, or sealed rock using technological air ducts that had already been laid by ancient builders for their own needs.
And this explains the grandeur of the Mont Cenis portals. They were building not an entrance to a tunnel, but effectively an entrance to a monument. They had to embellish, decorate, and conceal the fact that they found this object. The massive, antique-style portals served as a screen that masked the entrance to the legacy of a vanished civilization. This decorative, absolutely impractical luxury for an industrial object makes no sense if you are boring a hole in a mountain from scratch. But it becomes logical if you found a ready, majestic object and needed to give it a modern and European appearance. Mont Cenis is just the prelude. It showed that the accuracy and speed stated in the official reports are impossible for that era. But the real absurdity, which casts doubt not just on engineering capabilities, but on the very possibility of human existence in such conditions, awaits us in St. Gotthard, where the problems of geodesy are compounded by a thermodynamic dead end. If Mont Cenis was a geodetic miracle, St. Gotthard would have been a survival miracle if it had truly been bored from scratch. We move on to a tunnel where temperature and working conditions should have transformed the working crews into specters within a few weeks. In such conditions, at temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius and high humidity, a person can work at best for 15 to 30 minutes, after which heat exhaustion and depletion set in. Working in 3 shifts around the clock with the stated tunneling rate of 4.5 meters per day, this is not just heroism, it is a physical impossibility. The official explanation for this paradox again rests on ventilation. Allegedly, a powerful stream of cold air was supplied for cooling and gas removal. But here we again hit a thermodynamic dead end. Over a 15-kilometer length, in a narrow pipe constantly heated by the rock, any supplied cooling is instantly neutralized. The hot rock transfers heat to the air, and after a few kilometers, the air entering the tunnel becomes as hot as the surrounding rock. To cool the tunnel, refrigeration units and power that only appeared decades later, but certainly not in the 1870s, would have been required. Workers were not simply laboring. They should have been succumbing to gases, overheating to a critical state, and suffering from ailments caused by this inhuman climate. Nevertheless, the tunneling continued. And now let's move on to the issue of logistics, which reached its peak at St. Gotthard. According to estimates, millions of bricks and cut stones were used just for the lining of the tunnel walls, for creating the arches and portals. This is not just granite masonry, it's millions of tons of incoming construction material. At the same time, a continuous stream of millions of tons of rock should have been exiting the tunnel. Imagine the mountain roads leading to the tunnel entrances, narrow, winding, often snowy. A caravan consisting of hundreds of carts loaded with brick, cement, wood, coal, tools, and food should have been constantly moving along them, meeting an equally giant stream of carts with extracted rock. This is not just logistics. It is a logistical collapse and transport paralysis that should have stopped the construction in the very first winter. How was this continuous, bidirectional traffic maintained on primitive mountain roads for a decade? The answer may lie in the financial aspect. The construction of St. Gotthard cost astronomical sums. By the most modest estimates, over 289 million Swiss francs, an enormous amount for that time. Moreover, the project was implemented in the midst of stock crises and the economic downturn of the 1870s. Who paid for this feast? The money came from banks and investors who, it would seem, should have been extremely cautious about investing in such a risky and expensive project doomed to cost overruns due to technical difficulties. The only way investors could be guaranteed profit and completion of the work on time was to know that the tunnel already existed and would not encounter insurmountable obstacles.
Perhaps the most striking evidence of the difficult conditions were the rumors associated with the workers. The chief contractor, Louis Favre, who bore personal responsibility for the project's execution, suddenly passed away right inside the tunnel in 1879. The official version is a heart attack. But how convenient for those supervising the project when the person who knew all the inside information and had access to the real figures unexpectedly departs. It is not excluded that he was removed so that he wouldn't let slip that they were not drilling but unsealing ancient hermetically sealed barriers. In addition, a so-called tunnel sickness spread among the workers, the symptoms of which, severe anemia, severe sores, general depletion, were explained by hookworm parasites. But if you look at the description of the same symptoms, they closely resemble the consequences of contact with unknown toxins or even radioactive-induced illness. What if, while clearing ancient communications, the workers stumbled upon burial grounds of a past era where some unknown chemical substances or even radioactive elements were used? After all, an ancient civilization capable of building tunnels with such precision surely used different, more potent energy sources than harmless hydropower. We analyzed Mont Cenis and St. Gotthard, finding that the incredible geodetic accuracy, impossible working conditions, and absurd logistics clearly contradict the technologies of the 19th century. All these inconsistencies lead us to the only logical conclusion. It was not construction, but desealing. And this conclusion is perfectly confirmed by two key factors: the sudden appearance of wonder technology and the architectural style of the entrances. Let's recall the pneumatic drilling machine of Germain Sommier, which appeared precisely when the tunneling with a pickaxe and shovel reached a dead end. We are told that this was an innovative invention that saved the project. But here is the paradox. If this machine was so revolutionary, why was its application so local? And why was its effectiveness, according to accounts, quite questionable, and its design cumbersome and unreliable?
A change of version looks much more convincing. What if Sommeleur's machine was created not for drilling solid granite, for which it was clearly unsuitable, but for clearing? Imagine, the ancient transport main was blocked not by hard rock, but by a mixture of clay, collapsed rubble, and sand, the consequences of the cataclysm we are talking about. To bore through hard granite, colossal energy and power are needed. But to clear a relatively soft plug of compacted dirt, a pneumatic breaker is sufficient. If the tunnels were sealed, then these compressed air machines, which were themselves difficult to deliver 6 kilometers, would be ideal for crushing and removing relatively loose material that could not resist the airflow. Now, let's turn our attention to the tunnel portals themselves, the entrances. Let's take Mont Cenis as an example. We see monumental structures, columns, complex cut stone masonry, architectural decorations created in imitation of the antique style. This is not just a gate, it's an architectural masterpiece. But the question remains, why? The pragmatism of 19th-century engineers who cared exclusively about functionality and minimizing costs would never have allowed them to spend millions on building a temple-like entrance that would be covered in a layer of soot from steam locomotives within days and become part of a dirty industrial landscape. The only thing required from an entrance was protection against avalanches and rockfall. A simple, functional structure. The grandeur of the portals is a convincing argument that these were not just entrances but monuments. The engineers and authorities who discovered the ancient mains could not simply launch trains there and say, "We found this." They needed to claim the find. Creating majestic, man-made portals served as an ideological screen. They told the world, "Look, these majestic gates were built by us, our great engineers, which means what is inside is also our achievement." In fact, it was the framing of an ancient legacy as a modern industrial marvel. Adding to this is the aforementioned problem of the missing mountains of rubble. If you bore 13 or 15 kilometers of a mountain, you move millions of tons of solid rock. These millions of tons should form a pile at the tunnel entrance that is comparable in size to a small mountain. However, looking at old engravings and photographs, we see relatively small, neat platforms. Where did all this material go? If it were real construction, the spoil heaps would be colossal and would become a serious disposal problem. But if it was clearing, the volume of material removed was many times smaller, only the part that collapsed or sealed the entrance.
Thus, the absence of gigantic rock spoil heaps, the grandeur of the entrances, and the sudden appearance of pneumatic machines that look more like tools for clearing mud plugs than drills for granite. All of this together forms a picture of major renovation and exploitation of already existing structures. We arrive at the conclusion that the Mont Cenis and Gotthard tunnels were not bored from scratch. They were found, cleared, and put into operation by 19th-century engineers who, unable to explain their origin or replicate the construction technology, chose to pass the discovery off as their own feat. But if two tunnels could have been desealed, how can we explain the object that openly ignores the laws of economics, logistics, and thermodynamics? The Simplon tunnel. This structure takes the deception to a completely new, absurd level. After Mont Cenis, we move on to St. Gotthard, and here, where the tunnel length reaches 15 kilometers, the problems are no longer just engineering, they become physiological. If Mont Cenis puzzled us with geodetic accuracy, St. Gotthard questions the very possibility of human survival in its center. St. Gotthard was bored through rock where, as we already said, the rock temperature caused by the geothermal gradient reached 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. This was the so-called thermodynamic dead end. Inside the tunnel, with thousands of people working, the use of explosives, dynamite, which releases an enormous amount of heat, and the presence of moisture, the air temperature soared to unbearable levels. In such conditions, with high humidity, the human body very quickly loses its ability to regulate temperature. This led to heat exhaustion, dehydration, and a sharp decrease in work capacity. We are asked to believe that the problem was solved by compressed air being supplied, which simultaneously cooled the tunnel. But this is a physical absurdity. Over a 15-kilometer distance, in a narrow, constantly heated pipe, the supplied air heated up to the temperature of the surrounding rock within a few kilometers. To ensure working conditions throughout the entire length of the tunnel, colossal capacity refrigeration units would have been required, capable of cooling the air and rock for many kilometers. Such technologies only appeared in the industry decades later, and in the 1870s, they were inconceivable. Thus, the assertion of continuous and highly productive work in the center of the tunnel, with tunneling rates of up to 4.5 meters of granite per day, is a clear distortion of facts.
Workers simply could not physically remain there for long, let alone perform heavy, exhausting labor.
The most dire evidence of the abnormal working conditions was the so-called tunnel sickness, which massively affected the builders. Officially, this ailment was defined as anemia caused by hookworm parasites, which allegedly entered the body through dirty water and soil. However, the symptoms described by eyewitnesses and doctors raise serious questions. Severe anemia, severe sores, and general, extremely rapid depletion of the body. Why did official medicine so persistently insist on the version with primitive parasites? Because, if you look at the described symptoms impartially, they frighteningly resemble the consequences of contact with powerful, unknown toxins, or even a syndrome caused by radiation. What if the workers stumbled not just upon clay and rock, but unsealed, hermetic storage facilities or technical communications of an ancient civilization? A civilization capable of cutting mountains, likely used advanced, but possibly extremely hazardous to humans, energy sources or chemical compounds about which we have no knowledge. The version of tunnel sickness as a form of poisoning or radiation exposure does not seem far-fetched, considering the contractors who met their demise and the inhuman working conditions. This was not just an infection, but a kind of payment for invading the legacy of the past. The workers, in essence, acted as pioneer liquidators whose bodies suffered from contact with the remnants of a long-gone but technologically advanced era. To this is added another, perhaps the biggest enigma of St. Gotthard, the vanished army of builders. We are told that up to 5,000 people were simultaneously involved in the project. This is a colossal army of qualified stonemasons, drillers, and laborers. Where did such a number of workers come from in the 1870s Europe? This was a period when many countries, including France and Italy, were exhausted by conflicts, agrarian crises, and waves of immigration. Historical and demographic records are extremely sparse in documenting the movement of such a massive workforce. These people could not simply appear out of thin air, work for a decade in inhuman conditions, and then vanish without a trace in demographic data. Such a spectre army leads to the idea that the official figures were consciously inflated. Probably the actual number of people involved in the work was significantly smaller, as the work mainly consisted of clearing, not tunneling. But to create the myth of the heroic feat of thousands of people fighting the rock, inflated figures were required. The workers who were hired were mainly engaged not in drilling, but in servicing pneumatic machines, removing debris, installing temporary reinforcements, and most importantly, lining the tunnel. It is the lining of the tunnels, including St. Gotthard, that brings us back to the conversation about ancient technologies. Inside the tunnel, we see incredibly precise, often polygonal masonry of cut stone, where the blocks are fitted so tightly together that it is impossible to insert a blade between them. This technology, which evokes associations with megalithic structures in Peru or Baalbek, requires a tool capable of processing granite with jeweler's precision, using some method of cutting or melting. 19th-century stonemasons, armed with a chisel, could not have created such finishing. Why this impeccable accuracy in a dark tunnel where no one will see it? Because it is not finishing for beauty, but possibly a functional element. Such masonry could act as a wave guide, an insulator, or be part of a unified ancient energy system. A steam train, puffing and smoking, travels on a road created for something much more technologically advanced. We are like people who found a Boeing and are using it as a shed. Thus, St. Gotthard is not a tunnel, but an ancient artifact, Its construction is a myth designed to hide the fact that we, the current civilization, are living on fragments that we inherited. And if St. Gotthard was absurd from the perspective of thermodynamics, its successor, Simplon, surpassed all boundaries of economic and technical logic. If Mont Cenis and St. Gotthard presented incredible engineering puzzles, the Simplon tunnel, almost 20 kilometers, looks like an open mockery of any 19th-century economic and technical logic. It surpassed all previous records, becoming the longest in the world, and has one unique feature that is completely absurd for its time. It was built simultaneously in two parallel lines. The official explanation for this decision is that the second auxiliary tunnel, Tunnel 2, was necessary for better ventilation and for a future second railway track. But this is economic self-destruction. At the beginning of the 20th century, construction began in 1898. Boring one 20-kilometer tunnel was already an excessively expensive and risky undertaking. Doubling the costs and risks of boring a second, equally long, parallel tube that was not planned for immediate use has no pragmatic economic justification. No capitalist or financier would have sanctioned such a step if there was no convincing evidence that these two tunnels already existed. Consequently, the only rational conclusion consistent with the logic of clearing is that the engineers discovered not one, but two parallel transport mains, or one with a reserved technical drift, and considered that clearing both was much simpler and faster than boring expensive vertical shafts or installing a powerful ventilation system on the St. Gotthard principle. In this case, they simply removed the blockages from both tubes.
But the most dramatic and least explainable story of Simplon is related to water and temperature. During tunneling, the workers encountered a powerful source of hot thermal water. This was a flow with a temperature of about 55 degrees Celsius, which burst out under enormous pressure with a volume of about 500 liters per second. This is not just water. It's boiling water under pressure that flooded the tunnel, making further work impossible. How was this boiling flow, which was 10 kilometers from the entrance, stopped in 1901? At that time, there were no pumps or hermetic barriers capable of handling such a volume and pressure of hot water at such a distance. The attempt to pump out the water with primitive steam pumps would have been absurd. Steam cannot effectively combat such a volume of boiling water. Again, the version of the ancient legacy comes to the rescue. The incredible pressure and speed of water removal are explained by the fact that the engineers probably did not pump out the water, but repaired or activated a part of the ancient automatic drainage system of the tunnel. These mains could have been equipped with a complex water removal system that was sealed after a global cataclysm. When the tunnelers reached this point, they might have inadvertently or consciously restarted the system, and it itself coped with the flow that was within its means from the very beginning. Simplon, with its economically disadvantageous double-track solution and inconceivable struggle with thermal waters, is the most vivid argument in favor of the idea that we are using ready-made technologies. We did not create these tunnels. We merely readapted them for the needs of our primitive steam age, passing off a grandiose act of desealing as an engineering feat. This idea leads us to the final question. If this is not our progress, what was the true purpose of these structures?
We have seen that the rates, accuracy, and working conditions at Mont Cenis, St. Gotthard, and Simplon did not correspond to 19th century technologies. All of this leads to one logical hypothesis. These tunnels were not bored, they were found and cleared. Now, to definitively dispel the myth of the heroic tunnelers, we must closely examine what is on the walls of the tunnels, their finishing.
We are not talking about simple concrete pouring or rough stone masonry, which could be expected from pragmatic industrial construction. Inside these tunnels, especially in the old sections, we observe incredibly precise, often polygonal masonry of cut stone. The blocks, usually granite or quartz, are fitted to each other with such impeccable accuracy that it is impossible to insert a razor blade between them. This evokes a direct association with megalithic structures scattered throughout the world, from Cusco and Ollantaytambo in Peru to the mysterious Baalbek. It is there that we see the exact same, now lost technology of perfectly fitting stone without the use of cement. 19th-century stonemasons, armed with a chisel and hammer, did not possess a tool capable of processing granite with such jeweler's precision as if it were cut on a laser machine. And here arises the key question that finally shatters the official version. Why? Why is such impeccable, labor-intensive, incredibly expensive finishing needed in a dark railway tunnel? This masonry is hidden from the eyes of passengers. It is covered with soot from steam locomotives, and it serves only the functional purpose of preventing collapses. For this purpose, simple, rough masonry, or even concrete would have been sufficient. From the perspective of pragmatism, such work is a senseless waste of money, time, and resources.
The answer lies in the true purpose. This ideal masonry is probably not a decoration, but a functional element of ancient technology. Granite, quartz, the polygonal shape, and the accuracy of the fitting may indicate that the tunnel was originally intended for other purposes. A hypothesis is put forward that this masonry could have acted as a waveguide, an insulator, or been part of a single global energy system used by the previous civilization. Perhaps the tunnels were used not for steam locomotives, but for transporting energy, maglev, or even matter over vast distances. We inherited a structure created using technologies capable of cutting mountains and perfectly fitting stone. And we, applying our primitive level of development, were only able to launch a samovar on wheels, a puffing and smoking steam locomotive, along this ideal, technologically complex track. This creates a monstrous technological dissonance. A primitive machine travels along an engineer-perfect main. This best describes our place in history. We are a civilization of scavengers living on fragments. We did not build these tunnels. We merely restored ancient artifacts, passing them off as our achievement. And our inability to explain their true accuracy and complexity became the basis for creating the myth of heroic engineers. Thus, the tunnels in the Alps are not just monuments to the 19th century, but undeniable evidence of the existence of a more advanced civilization. But, if it was so advanced, why did it vanish? What monstrous cataclysm wiped it off the face of the earth, leaving us only these sealed mains? After analyzing the impossible accuracy, thermodynamic absurdity, and financial anomaly of the Alpine tunnels, as well as the incredible polygonal masonry of their arches, we must finally realize what was presented to us as construction was actually the Great Excavation. 19th-century engineers did not bore through mountains. They merely eliminated the consequences of a planetary cataclysm that sealed the existing infrastructure. The scale of this act of appropriation is astonishing. We were led to believe that from the 1850s to the 1910s, humanity achieved inconceivable rates of progress, laying thousands of kilometers of railways, building hundreds of bridges and dozens of tunnels through the most inaccessible mountain ranges. These rates, if official data are to be believed, were simply incredible for that level of technology and logistical capabilities. The only scenario in which these figures and construction times align is the acknowledgement that the tracks were already laid. Only a few elements were missing: clearing the blockages, replacing rotted ties, restoring collapsed areas, and launching a new mode of transport, the steam locomotive, along this ready track.
This leads us to the very core, the rails of the gods. Pay attention to the standard railway gauge, 1,435 millimeters. The official history links this to the Roman cart gauge, which sounds utterly absurd. Why project a size based on the width of a horse-drawn cart onto a global transport system? A much more logical hypothesis is that this gauge is the technological standard of an ancient, unified, global network. This size could have been optimal for magnetic levitation or some energy fields used by the previous civilization. We did not invent this width. We inherited it, and it became mandatory because all the tracks, tunnels, and bridges we found were built specifically to this universal standard. We could not change it because changing it would mean losing the ability to use the gigantic, already ready infrastructure. A technological dissonance is evident. On one hand, we have a perfectly straight, engineer-perfect tunnel with polygonal masonry, capable of withstanding loads and speeds unthinkable for the 19th century. On the other hand, a primitive steam locomotive crawls through this tunnel, essentially a steam engine that pulls several cars with great difficulty, smoking and damaging walls that were possibly part of some giant energy circuit. This is the clearest evidence of degradation. We inherited tunnels built using stone processing technologies that are now lost, and we use them for a purpose that is likely thousands of times below their original potential. The tunnels were not built with a pickaxe and shovel. They were created with plasma or sonic vibrations, and we simply excavated them. This knowledge fundamentally changes the view of our place in history. We are not the peak of progress, but survivors who found refuge in the ruins. This leads us to the main and final question. What happened to that civilization, and what caused these majestic mains to be sealed? The tunnels are not just roads. They are evidence of a cataclysm. If we look at old engravings and photographs of the alpine regions of the 19th century, we see landscapes that do not look like natural mountain terrain, but like an area that survived a monstrous mudslide. This is chaos, a pileup of boulders, stones, and clay that does not resemble natural geological processes. This allows us to put forward the hypothesis of the clay flood, or a global cataclysm that occurred relatively recently, perhaps even in the 18th or early 19th century, and wiped the traces of the previous civilization off the face of the earth. The tunnels, these majestic, horizontal arteries, were sealed with a clay plug, and collapses, those very blockages that we mistakenly took for rock bored through by our engineers.
Thus, the perfect alignment of the tunnels, which we discussed at the beginning, ceases to be a geodetic miracle. It becomes the moment when the tunnelers from both sides of Mont Cenis and St. Gotthard removed the last internal barrier of dirt and collapsed stones, finally connecting the two already existing parts of the tunnel. This knowledge leads to a shocking conclusion. We are a civilization living on the ashes. We did not build what surrounds us, and our progress is, in essence, merely the ability to use the remnants of someone else's grandeur. It is this fact that forces the powers that be to fiercely defend the official myth of the heroic engineers of the 19th century. Why? Because if we admit that we did not build the tunnels, we will have to answer a much more dangerous question. What else that surrounds us does not belong to us? If the tunnels are ancient, then what about the thousands of kilometers of railways, water pipelines, foundations of old buildings, and perfect roads? Perhaps all of this is part of a single, perished infrastructure. The official history, therefore,
is a screen behind which the fact of a global cataclysm and our humiliating position, the position of users, not creators, is hidden. This falsehood is intended to keep us in a state of technological and historical naivety, so that we do not begin to demand the return of our true legacy, the knowledge and technologies that could make us a truly free and developed civilization. We can only demand the truth, and the next time we drive through any of these mountain arteries, remember, we are traveling on a road not created by us. This is a path into the past that can become a path to the future if we dare to admit the truth. History lives when it is told. Subscribe. What comes next, you have probably never heard before.